Hey guys, welcome to the start of week 3 in our very brief course. We're almost halfway through the course already. This week we're transitioning into Rodolfo Anaya's Heart of Aslan. It's his second novel. If you know the novelist, chances are you're familiar with his first novel, Bless Me Ultima, a beautiful coming-of-age story, well worth your time, and it could have easily fit on our magical realist text assignment list, but I chose this novel because, as it's probably pretty clear by now, post-colonial theory is primarily concerned with the politics of identity, the politics of how identity is stripped or is reformed because of the influence of a colonial power, right? And what happens to that sense of identity, whether it's community, whether it's an individual's sense of self or voice or their agency. And in the some of the theory that I posted here, it begins by constructing that post-colonial theory and magical realism with writers from Latin America, particularly Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which if we had more time, if we only had more time. So he is probably the forerunner. But Anaya, I think, is writing in a similar kind of political vein as Marquez, in that he's using the form of a novel of a family's progression from moving from their very small rural area into what at that time was a larger urban area in Albuquerque, much like it's the stories of journeying families across the West, or much like the story like Grapes of Wrath, right? The Jodes moving from Oklahoma to California, right? It's not just a fish out of water story. It's also a person being taken from their environment and thrown into a new one where they have to redefine themselves, or their sense of self is redefined for them. And that's political. That's not voting left or right political. That's political in terms of who has power and who is denied power, who can do the naming and who is deemed other, who is deemed outside. In the Chavez family, right? Clemente, his wife, his children, they begin in a certain position and have to find their own way. In the process, we see a story of a family that kind of comes unraveled in many ways, whether it's through substance abuse, whether it's through a change of norms, whether it's through new peer groups, whether it's through trying to find a sense of spiritual and cultural connection. All of these are explored. Right? And so at the time when this novel was first published in the late 70s, the novel takes place primarily probably in the early or mid-50s after the Korean War. We see some sense of that in a few of the flashbacks or characterizations. So what's happening in not just America, but what's happening in Chicano culture in the mid-1950s? Anaya is a huge name when it comes to the Chicano civil rights movement that began in the 1960s. Chicano civil rights movement really is kind of a call for Mexican American identity, Mexican American finding a way that Mexican American groups and activists finding ways to make their voices and their concerns and their sense of place known, establishing a sense of personhood for their communities. And Anaya is a major voice in that. So his writing about this kind of a situation, this family going into, moving from a small rural location into a barrio in Albuquerque, really is a metaphor for what many families, what many communities, what many groups had gone through into that kind of mid-20th century urbanization, or leaving the rural for the city. And especially as then the Chicano identity movement became much more consistent and started gaining traction, Anaya's name and Anaya's art really became connected with that. So how does that manifest itself in a magical realist text like this? Well, it's not just that there's cultural stories or cultural myths behind what's happening under the radar, but also that drives the character's actions. It drives the character's sense of self. And that's massively important, because Clemente, he goes through all kinds of ups and downs as this story goes forward, right? He begins in a certain place. He's the head of the household, right? Very much he feels like he's in a patriarchal role. And then that role is stripped away, both through loss of his own job, through his alcoholism, through his daughters and wife becoming, not if not self-sufficient, becoming financially secure to an extent, which for him is a radical challenge to his place in the household, right? And then there's all these kind of these magical, mythical, marvelous side characters that help push him onto this journey of spiritual and cultural discovery, right? Where he actually begins to fantasize about Aslan, this first nation, this of the first peoples. And here's where, connecting back to what something, one of the links that I had in the first week's kind of theory breakdown, in the literariness.org article that I linked in the first week, the author of that article cites Kumkum Sangari. Now, she was a critic teaching out of Milwaukee who writes about Latin American magical realists and their political edge, or their attempts to subvert that colonial influence. I think what I'm about to quote here, we can connect to Anaya's work here, even though he's writing about Americans in an American land. He is writing about marginalized and sidelined people, right? Especially coming from rural and Mexican American backgrounds. Right? When she writes, "Marvelous realism answers an emergent society's need for renewed self-description." Right? It questions the Western capitalist myth of modernization and progress and asserts without nostalgia an indigenous pre-industrial realm of possibility. Now, what does that have to do with Anaya's text? I think we connect that to not just the class struggle, right? The workers against the corrupt union, against the union boss, the workers against the corrupt, a train yard, which becomes this big symbol of the overbearing of capitalism in and of itself, but also that desire for that sense of place, right? Now, if you look up the myth of Aslan in Chicano mythology, in Mexican and Mexican American mythology, Aslan is a mythical place that did exist, and it is thought to have existed somewhere in the American Southwest. So Anaya is writing about something that technically could be in Albuquerque or Albuquerque's backyard. So it's not a stretch. That kind of cultural connection between mythology and in spirituality, and then this kind of both coming of age and fish out of water story. And that's where Clemente makes his stand to become that leader that is going to lead these other workers and families out from under the thumb of the corrupt and brutal conditions that they're working under, the unsafe work environment, the unsteady work, the threat of being fired or destitute or being banned from the grocery store for speaking out. These are all wonderful tropes that we see popping up across not just magical realist texts, but across texts of the mid and late part of the 20th century, right? So class issues, class struggle, and a group struggling to find its place where its voice and agency is made known. Anaya is working with that. So through our discussion, I'd like us to focus on that. Certainly the other characters in this novel, the other magical elements should be focused on, but certainly I think Clemente and Jason's spiritual awakenings, and then that sense of cultural connection to this myth, and how they realize it or recognize it in their own lives, and how they kind of come to terms with it in where they're living. I'd like that to be part of our discussion for this week. Looking forward to the work you put together. I love the discussion board so far. I love the back and forth conversations. Keep going up with that. Keep egging each other on for more and more content, more and more discussion. The more you can cite the text, the better. I love reading it, and I'll have scores for everything posted as much as I can over the next week. Looking forward to it.